On a quiet evening today, if you stand on the bridge over the Peshtigo River in northeastern Wisconsin, it is hard to imagine that this calm little town was once described as hell on earth. Peshtigo looks like any other small Midwestern community, with houses, shops, and a church spire rising above the trees, and only a few signs and a museum hint that, in a single night in 1871, the town was almost completely erased by fire. Most people have heard of the Great Chicago Fire, but few know that on the very same night, October 8, 1871, a much deadlier inferno roared through the woods around Peshtigo and killed more people than any other wildfire in American history. In the years before the fire, Peshtigo was a booming lumber town carved out of dense northern forests that had stood for centuries. The area's vast stands of pine and hardwood attracted loggers and investors, and Peshtigo grew into an important center for sawmills and wood products, supplying timber to cities around the Great Lakes and as far as Chicago. Logs floated down the Peshtigo River to mills, where they were cut into boards and shingles, and piles of slabs and waste wood stacked up around the yards. To clear land quickly for farming, railroads, and more logging, people often used fire. Slash and burn was the standard method for getting rid of stumps, branches, and brush. By the summer of 1871, these habits had turned the forests and clearings around Peshtigo into a vast storehouse of dry fuel. The preceding fall and winter had been dry, followed by an even drier spring, and one of the driest summers anyone could remember. Creeks and marshes shrank, river levels dropped, and even native communities in the region struggled to use canoes in low water that was normally deep enough for travel and for gathering wild rice. Loggers, farmers, and railroad crews continued to set small fires to clear land, and many of those fires were left to burn themselves out, smoldering along routes and in peat underground. By early October, the region was already wrapped in a smoky haze, dotted with small, persistent fires in the woods. Peshtigo itself was a wooden town surrounded by wooden industry. Houses, sidewalks, shops, warehouses, and the enormous factory of the Peshtigo Company were built largely from lumber cut just upriver. Wooden bridges crossed the Peshtigo River. Wooden fences lined the streets, and everywhere there were stacks of boards, piles of waste wood, and drying logs. It was a town that had grown rich on trees and saw little danger in fire, because for years the small burns and clearing fires had seemed manageable. But underneath that confidence, the conditions were lining up for something that no one there had ever seen before. Sunday, October 8, 1871, began much like the days before it, dry, smoky, and unusually warm. People went to church in their best clothes, gathered for Sunday dinners, and tried not to worry too much about the fires they knew were burning in the forests around the town. Some residents remarked on the strange quality of the sky that day, a kind of yellow-brown haze that dimmed the sun and carried the faint smell of burning wood. Others noticed that the wind seemed restless, gusting and shifting, but that was hardly unusual in a logging region used to autumn storms blowing in from the west. No one could see that a cold front was moving toward them, bringing strong southwest winds that would soon whip the scattered fires into a single, monstrous blaze. As evening approached, the wind picked up dramatically, and the small fires that had smoldered in fields and slash piles suddenly sprang to life. Sparks lifted into the air and were carried ahead of the flames, dropping into dry grass, wooden fences, and piles of logging debris and igniting new fires in moments. Witnesses later recalled hearing a low rumbling sound growing in the distance, like the distant approach of a train, and seeing the horizon glow red and orange as the woods themselves began to burn. The separate blazes that ringed Peshtigo were being pulled together by the strong winds into a single fire front moving toward the town. Before anyone in Peshtigo fully understood what was happening, the fire had begun to behave like a living thing, racing through the forest with terrifying speed. What descended on Peshtigo that night was more than a forest fire. It was a firestorm. As the flames grew higher and hotter, they superheated the air above them, causing it to rise and pull in fresh air from all sides in a violent rush. The wind that fed the fire became a hurricane-force blast, driving trees, embers, and whole roofs through the air. Fire leaped from treetop to treetop and from building to building faster than a person could run, turning the sky over Peshtigo into a single sheet of flame. Some witnesses even described whirling fire tornadoes, columns of flame and burning debris that spun off from the main front and tore apart anything in their path. People in town had only minutes to react. One moment, residents were finishing supper or putting children to bed. The next, they heard frantic shouts, church bells clanging, and the roar of the approaching blaze. Women snatched children from their beds. Men tried to form makeshift fire brigades with buckets and wet blankets, and families raced to gather a few valuables, not realizing there was no time for any of it. The air itself became difficult to breathe as smoke and heat rolled over the town, stinging eyes and burning lungs. Sparks began to fall like fiery rain, igniting roofs and porches even before people stepped out their doors. One of the most detailed accounts of what happened in Peshtigo comes from a Catholic priest, Father Peter Pernin, who later published a memoir of that night. He described leading parishioners and neighbors toward the Peshtigo River as the fire closed in on the town from multiple directions, the flames so bright that they turned night into a ghastly day. He wrote of people screaming, praying, and stumbling through smoke-choked streets littered with burning debris, many of them already injured or half-blinded by flying embers. At one point, he clung to a floating piece of wood in the river with others, the water around them crowded with terrified people, livestock, and debris, while the heat above was so intense that it seared exposed skin. His recollections preserve the sense of panic, confusion, and disbelief that gripped the town in those terrible hours. The river quickly became the only refuge. As the fire tornadoes swept through streets and over buildings, many residents of Peshtigo ran for the water, dragging children, elderly relatives, and even animals with them. People plunged into the river fully clothed, some clutching fences, logs, or anything that would float, while cows and horses rushed into the water alongside them, bellowing and thrashing in terror. Those who made it into the river were not safe from suffering. The water was cold, ash and burning debris fell around them, and the heat from the firestorm overhead was intense enough to blister skin. Some people drowned or died from shock and hypothermia, while others survived by repeatedly ducking their heads under the water to escape the scorching air. Among those who fled to the river that night was a 5-year-old girl named Elizabeth Wilk. When the firestorm descended on Peshtigo, her family rushed toward the river along with many of their neighbors, trying to cross a bridge that had already caught fire. The bridge planks were burning beneath their feet as they ran, and flames closed in from both banks. Somehow, they managed to reach the far side and scramble down into the water, where they clung to a saw log through the night while the town burned around them. Years later, Elizabeth recalled the view in a few stark words. All you could see was flames. Elizabeth and her family survived, but not without lasting scars. She suffered burns on her hands and legs that took months to heal, and left marks she would carry for the rest of her life. After the fire, the family was transported to Milwaukee, where they spent about 6 months in a hospital recovering from their injuries. When they were finally discharged, they did not return to a rebuilt Peshtigo. Instead, they moved to Port Washington to restart their lives, leaving behind a town that had been reduced to ashes. Her story, passed down through descendants, remains one of the most vivid personal accounts of surviving the Peshtigo Fire. Another story preserved by local historians is that of the Villers family and a baby named Florence. Martin and Octavia Villers were not originally from Peshtigo, but they happened to be there with their infant daughter in October 1871, for reasons that remain unclear. When the firestorm struck, they, like so many others, prepared to flee toward the Peshtigo River. They placed baby Florence in a basket for the escape, intending to carry her with them as they ran, but in the chaos, a sheet of flame and smoke separated them from the child. For a brief moment, the parents lost sight of their baby as the fire roared through the town. Close by was a 14-year-old orphan named Joseph Lacrosse, who was living with the Villers family at the time. Seeing that the baby had been cut off from her parents by the flames, Joseph grabbed the basket and made a split-second decision that saved both of their lives. Instead of trying to outrun the fire through the streets, he climbed down into a well, holding the baby close as the inferno raged above them. Through the night, as buildings collapsed and the town was consumed, Joseph sheltered with Florence in that narrow shaft, while smoke and flame swept over the surface. When he finally climbed out at dawn, baby Florence still in his arms, he found that almost nothing remained of Peshtigo. As he wandered through the ruins looking for survivors, Joseph came across a cow that had been badly burned but was still alive. With the baby crying from hunger, he carefully drew milk into his hand and fed it to her. One small act of care amid an ocean of devastation. By another stroke of luck, Martin and Octavia Villers had survived elsewhere along the river, and they were reunited with their daughter in the aftermath. In later years, Florence grew up, married, and had a large family. By the time one of her descendants wrote down the story, she and her husband, Eli Kayemberg, had more than 500 descendants, all of whom owed their existence to Joseph's quick thinking that night. Stories like those of Elizabeth Wilk, Father Pernin, and the Villers family give faces to a disaster that, in statistics alone, is almost overwhelming. The firestorm that hit Peshtigo and the surrounding region burned somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million acres of land, an area roughly the size of the state of Connecticut. It destroyed at least 16 or 17 towns and settlements, including Peshtigo and the nearby community of Brussels, as well as scattered logging camps and farms. Estimates of the death toll range from around 1,200 to as many as 2,500 people, making it not only the deadliest wildfire in U.S. history, but one of the deadliest fires of any kind on the North American continent. In Peshtigo alone, the number of dead was in the hundreds, with entire families vanishing in the flames. The fire moved so fast that many people had no chance to escape at all. Survivors later said the flames traveled with tornado-like speed, sometimes appearing to jump over stretches of land or even over parts of Green Bay to ignite communities on the Dore Peninsula. The fire consumed so much oxygen so quickly that some people trying to flee simply collapsed, and, according to some accounts, even burst into flames as the superheated air engulfed them. Others were overcome by thick, choking smoke before they could reach the river or open country. When the fire finally began to die out, helped by rain on October 10th, the landscape it left behind was described as a blackened, steaming wilderness, where it was hard to recognize where streets and buildings had once been. In the days after the fire, survivors emerged from rivers, wells, and makeshift shelters to a world that barely resembled their old town. Smoldering ruins and charred tree trunks stood where houses, churches, and mills had been. Many people were badly burned, injured, or in shock, wandering among the ashes trying to locate family members who had not survived. Livestock lay dead in fields and along the riverbanks, adding to the grim smell of smoke and scorched earth. Temporary camps and shelters sprang up for those who had lost everything, and relief efforts began as news slowly reached the outside world. Yet, even the news coverage of the disaster was overshadowed. On the same night that Peshtigo burned, Chicago, 250 miles to the south, was also suffering a massive fire that destroyed large sections of the city and captured national and international attention. The Great Chicago Fire became famous in newspapers, songs, and history books, while the Peshtigo Fire, which killed far more people, faded from the broader public's memory. For decades, many Americans never heard of Peshtigo at all, and those who did were often local residents, descendants of survivors, or specialists in fire history. This imbalance in memory is one reason the Peshtigo Fire is sometimes called the Forgotten Fire, even though its human cost was enormous. Despite this, the fire did change things. The disasters of October 1871, from Peshtigo to Chicago to other fires in Michigan, helped raise awareness of how dangerous careless logging practices and all wooden construction could be. Investigations highlighted the role of slash-and-burn clearing, piles of dry logging debris, and sparks from steam locomotives in fueling such catastrophic blazes. Over time, forestry practices, building codes, and fire prevention strategies slowly evolved in response to lessons drawn from these fires. In Wisconsin, the memory of Peshtigo also contributed to the creation of institutions and policies aimed at preventing wildfires and protecting communities built in forested landscapes. Today, Peshtigo honors what happened through memorials, a cemetery where many victims are buried in mass graves, and a small museum that preserves artifacts and survivor stories. Visitors can see melted glass, twisted metal, and household objects recovered from the ruins, each one a reminder that the fire destroyed not just buildings, but lives and everyday routines. The museum and local historical society have collected accounts from families like the Wilkes and the Villers, preserving memories that might otherwise have been lost as generations passed. Every year, commemorations mark the anniversary of the fire, keeping alive the story of a night when all hell seemed to ride into town on the back of the wind. When you put all of these pieces together, the long drought, the logging debris, the scattered fires, the sudden wind, the firestorm, and the survival stories, you get a picture of how an ordinary logging town became the site of the deadliest wildfire in U.S. history. It is a story of human industry colliding with the forces of nature, and of how quickly a familiar world can be turned into something unrecognizable. But it is also a story of people who, when faced with an unimaginable wall of flame, held on to logs in a river, climbed into wells with infants in their arms, and did whatever they could to give themselves and their loved ones one more chance to see the morning.